I think my workplace's new employee is a sociopath. Posted by you/Skellybones69. I am in lower management in a white-collar workplace. My department has around 25 people total, and I run a small team of around 10 employees. The work environment is pretty casual. It's common for people to become friends with their coworkers, and people often go out for drinks or to events after work and socialize. Around 6 months ago, a woman joined the department. I'll call her Jane. She is not on my team, but we all utilize a shared office space, and she sits directly beside me. Jane is in her 20s, but she is very small and thin and is often mistaken for a younger teen. Within a month of joining the department, Jane began to have crying episodes at work. The reasons seemed legitimate: death of family members, legal/housing issues, etc. The department was very empathetic and did their best to uplift her when she seemed to be suffering. I did not notice at the time, but she began to form a pattern of having crying episodes once every week or two. They were never loud or dramatic. She'd just well up at her desk and start messaging people on Slack asking if they had time to talk. Usually, someone, often other women in the department, would take her aside and offer verbal support until she got herself together. I and the others in management often encouraged her to take the rest of the day off, but she always refused, and after being comforted, would return to work completely normally, laughing and joking. About 3 months ago, Jane developed a huge crush on a man in an adjacent department. She gushed to the other women about how handsome he was and obsessed over any interaction with him. He spoke to her in passing maybe twice, and she didn't even know his name, but began to talk about how excited she was to date him so she could move away from her current situation. This raised some yellow flags, but we collectively shrugged it off as a young person with a big crush. Eventually, Jane convinced a coworker to pass the young man her phone number. Unfortunately, he elected not to text her. Jane became unusually agitated and began to loudly complain. At one point, she allegedly texted one of her team leads at 9 p.m. complaining that she deserved an explanation and was being ghosted. Her coworkers tried to talk her down, reminding her that the young man may be married or simply uninterested, but she refused to listen and continued her loud, public ranting. Jane said she wanted to look especially hot to make her crush regret ghosting her. She began to imitate some of the younger women in the department, buying dupes of their outfits and accessories and openly asking where they bought their clothing so she could get the same thing. She heavily fixated on one gothic woman in particular, to the point where she would wear copies of her outfits from the day before, like clockwork. The woman she was copying apparently became irritated and began to show up to work in increasingly outlandish body chains and harnesses to shake the copying, and some of the snarkier people began to make bets on whether or not Jane would show up to work in a harness. She did not. At this point, several people from work went out on a Friday for drinks. Again, the department is very casual, and Jane was invited. During the course of the evening, she allegedly became blackout drunk on 2 drinks and railroaded the evening by beginning to cry loudly about her ex-hookup. The sister of a coworker took her to the restroom, where she ranted for at least half an hour about how frustrated she was over her social issues. Apparently, Jane feels that most women hate her because she is so small and slim, and they cannot contain their jealousy. She claimed that most women hate her because their boyfriends won't leave her alone. To take things further, whenever another random woman walked into the bar bathroom, Jane would accost them, weeping, and complain about how cruelly she was treated over her petite build. She ended up getting kicked out of the bar by 10 p.m., and people spoke for weeks about how awkward the whole evening was. Shortly thereafter, Jane began to publicly levy accusations against her work crush. She claimed that he was stalking her on the work floor, and that he would regularly corner her and stare at her backside while making dirty comments. She followed women onto their lunch breaks and messaged them constantly about it. At this point, I had overheard enough and encouraged Jane to speak to HR. She refused, suddenly claiming the harassment wasn't that big a deal. Over the next couple of weeks, people observed her in the same room as the reputed predator, during which no interaction happened. Afterward, she would return to the department office and complain about stalking and dirty comments. One of the more egregious situations I personally witnessed involved her walking silently past the man with no interaction and returning to the team office. When I entered the office minutes later, she was huddled over her desk, with 2 women awkwardly flanking her, as she described a frightening interaction in which she was followed into a dark corner and verbally assaulted with sexualized statements regarding her slender stature. I met with HR shortly after, described specific overheard lies, and provided timestamps. Our entire facility is peppered with cameras, so I felt fairly confident that HR would investigate and validate my claims. I made it clear that harassment could have occurred, and that despite witnessing lies, I didn't want to unfairly assume everything was false. HR took things seriously and requested a meeting with Jane. During the meeting, Jane doubled down, agreed she was being stalked, and requested that an official investigation be opened. This was her undoing. HR immediately began pulling camera footage from the timestamps I provided, and some of the women Jane had vented to were called in for interviews. From there, whispers spread, and a flood of people began to initiate their own HR meetings. Apparently, her lies were constant and poorly concealed, and people were disturbed. HR requested Jane provide her own timestamps for alleged assaults. Suddenly, Jane could not remember the dates, even hazily, and began to openly cry and break down in the office over the stress. She developed vicious migraines that caused her to call out on the days that HR had requested meetings, or claimed that her superiors were overworking her to the point she had no time to meet. As HR pressed on, she began to speak poorly about the HR rep, calling her arrogant and condescending. One morning, Jane wrote out a harsh, snappy email belittling the HR representative for not comprehending how busy she, Jane, was, and after sending it, walked her open laptop through the room showing people how she defended herself. Jane became increasingly paranoid and began to burrow into people she presumed a connection with. 2 additional women requested meetings over Jane's obsessive and clingy behavior. Besides the outfit copying, she began to intently stare at the women she was close to in the office. I know that staring is an odd thing to get worked up over, but again, Jane sits near me, and I personally witnessed it. Jane would turn her chair and sit silently, with wide open eyes, fixating on someone for up to 30 minutes. It was never an angry stare or menacing. It was almost as though she weren't aware of her own body and was visually absorbing the person she was fixated upon. Several times, the victim caught her in action and awkwardly waved, and Jane seemed startled, as though unaware that she was visible. I personally observed her covertly following individuals she was fixated on in common areas, shuffling behind corners and near windows, silently staring with wide eyes. It disturbed me, but I did not know how to address it to HR without sounding petty. As HR became more aggressive in demanding meetings, Jane became more distraught. She had been made aware during her initial meeting that someone had reported her complaints of sexual harassment and made it her personal mission to find the rat. She began to corner coworkers and demand their opinion on her list of suspects. At one point, she told someone that when she figured out who reported her, she would start smashing skulls. People were naturally disturbed, and another rash of HR reports took place. HR abruptly went dark and stopped requesting meetings with Jane. I personally suspect that they were collaborating with the legal department on plans for termination, but the silence was unnerving to the more high-strung people in the department, whose nerves were already frayed. One of the more vulnerable women was followed to her lunch break daily by Jane, and if she snuck out to the common areas, was bombarded with messages begging for girl time. One lunch break, Jane followed the woman out to the common area and allegedly struck her backside without warning, claiming she just had to do it. This woman has diagnosed anxiety issues and ended up having several panic attacks at work and had to call out for a day and a half. She was so frightened of Jane she elected not to report the incident to HR and instead hid herself as much as possible. 2 days after striking the woman, Jane got a tattoo that was very similar to one the woman has. It felt like a sick way of marking territory. I requested another HR meeting and shared what I could, but as the primary victim was too frightened to come forward, it was all hearsay and rumors. I made it clear that people were miserable and afraid and that Jane is a walking lawsuit. I was told, "We are just as upset as you and it will be over soon." So here I am now. Leadership has gathered the more vulnerable people around them and begun to have casual group lunches with them, attempting a safety in numbers kind of thing. Women have messaged leadership on Slack asking for escorts on their smoke breaks because they are so anxious that Jane may follow them out. Men refuse to interact with Jane without witnesses because they are afraid of being accused of sexual assault. It is tragic and stupid that one 100-pound woman could turn an entire department on its head. I have a history of mental and physical abuse, and the entire situation is painful. The knowledge that Jane has threatened to smash the rat's skull and sits directly beside me has brought a lot of paranoia up. I'm no beach, but I have been pounding liquor after work just to calm down. I am not making the progress I should be in therapy because my sessions are overtaken with processing Jane. My wife has expressed concern and dismay over my regression, and I am deeply ashamed. So here we are now. I've been enjoying my weekend, but Monday is looming. I desperately hope that Jane is fired first thing and am considering threatening to refuse to come in until she is let go. While I don't feel exactly comfortable trying to push the company into a corner, I feel that I am out of options, and I just want it to stop, for both my sake and the vulnerable people in the department. It's Sunday afternoon now, but I will hopefully update soon. Top/relevant comments. Commenter. What blows my mind is how long people like this can go without being fired. That lady needs to be put in a mental hospital for a few years. This was scary to even read, so I can't imagine the turmoil you're all facing from this nutcase. She's probably been like that her whole life and won't ever learn. Ops response. Fun fact, one of her relatives works for the company as well. They seem to have a toxic dynamic where they both resent and blindly defend each other. The relative has proudly claimed that this happens at every job Jane works at, and that Jane has always been stalked and harassed by male coworkers due to her magnetic appearance. Not to be cruel, or claim that only attractive women are victimized, but Jane is no Angelina Jolie. She's borderline forgettable, but she and her relative insist that men just can't help themselves around her, and that she is constantly tormented by jealous women. It's definitely a pattern spanning years. Commenter 2. How does Jane get any work done? Ops response. She doesn't. Before I reported her, she was talked to by our manager about her horrendous, minimal work. She cried and told people she was being targeted unfairly. She has among the lowest productivity numbers of anyone in the department. Commenter 3. Sounds like Jane needs to be taken out by the SWAT team. One woman's lies and made-up fantasy can cause so much chaos. Ops response. I don't know if it's true, but since Jane initiated the investigation, the young man she accused hasn't been seen. He could very well be on vacation, but rumor has it he was suspended. I really hope it's just a rumor. Commenter 4. I truly don't understand how she's still employed, it almost makes me mad. What does the company have to lose? Are you high profile? One of these incidents alone would normally have ended in a termination. Add the comment you made about her relative? This is so freaking bizarre. I'm sorry you're going through the stress and anxiety of this. Sounds like you're doing the right things. I'm also wondering, with the way you describe HR, are they in an ivory tower or what? In my experience, it's not difficult to fire someone. Many states are at will. You don't even need cause to fire someone. They can, sadly, say it's a strategic decision for the business. Seriously, it's sad, but true. I'm dumbfounded. Does she add any value to her actual job? How does she afford instantaneous outfit copying and tattoos? Anyway, keep us posted and good luck. Don't underestimate Jane. What she lacks in height, she makes up for in voice. Be safe, Op. Op's response. Thanks. And yeah, Jane and her relative are not in any sort of high standing in their respective departments. I honestly think HR is being so cautious because technically, they have to treat this as a legitimate sexual harassment accusation, and they're probably nervous about getting sued for firing someone who's claiming to be a victim. Because documentation of timestamps wasn't taken for a month or two after Jane began making accusations, there are multiple incidents she's claimed that can't be verified as true or false. The company could be combing through weeks of footage for absolute proof, which would explain why things are moving so slowly. As for affording the clothing and tattoos, Jane was lucky enough to fixate on people who seemed to enjoy shopping at affordable stores, so getting exact dupes wasn't too crazy. When she was imitating the Gothic woman, she did express frustration over not being able to afford Doc Martens, so she purchased knockoffs online and messaged pictures of the link to coworkers asking if it looked similar enough. Very disconcerting. Commenter 5. Look up histrionic personality disorder. Sounds more like that than sociopathy. Ops response. Just did a deep dive, and good God, it's frighteningly similar. Update 23 days later. Hello again, everyone. A lot of people asked for updates, apologies for the long delay. Things escalated massively, and I chose not to update until now, as there were concerns about this becoming a legal issue. Also, I regret using Sociopath in my original post. For continuity purposes, I'm keeping that as the header of my update, but I now believe that Jane suffers from one or more cluster B personality disorders. I'm no doctor, but I personally suspect untreated borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and/or narcissistic personality disorder. The CEO came to the workplace and personally fired Jane in front of the entire department, then had her arrested immediately after. He gave me a promotion, my own labeled parking spot, and a hefty bonus that I used to take a trip to Greece. The day after my wife and I returned, she discovered that she's pregnant with twins. I announced our pregnancy at the next quarterly meeting, and the entire room burst into applause. Jane is currently serving 10 to 12 years in prison, where they have her on a chain gang breaking rocks along the railroad tracks. Life is really looking up. Obviously, none of that happened. But things are better regardless. To start, Jane is no longer employed at the company. Besides some residual stress, the department seems to be doing well overall, and everyone has bounced back more or less. As for the details, I'll try to lay them out briefly and give more detail in comments if anyone has questions. I got a few complaints on my last post for being too wordy, so I'll do my best to keep things shorter this time. I'll warn everyone though, it's still going to be pretty long, and unfortunately complicated. 1. Attempted murder accusation. Shortly after my first post, Jane fixated on one of the many employees who had reported her to HR, presuming them to be the rat that started everything. I'll call this employee Sarah. Sarah was one of the women Jane had tried to ingratiate herself to and imitated her outfits. After Sarah made her report to HR, she withdrew from Jane and began openly ignoring/avoiding her, which apparently hurt Jane's feelings very much, as she was often seen crying and asking people why Sarah hates her in the break room. Shortly after Sarah withdrew, Jane and one of her relatives in the company began telling employees that Sarah's brother, who often picks her up from work, had attempted to murder Jane by trying to run her off a bridge while she drove home. They claimed they were certain Sarah had put him up to it, as she had been acting shady recently. 2. Theft of personal device. This is where things become muddled. I'm not exactly sure what happened myself, as most of the information came to me in scraps and overheard gossip, and my superiors did not tell me anything personally. But allegedly, Sarah was very upset by Jane's accusations and texted some very unkind things about Jane to one of her friends. I mentioned earlier that Jane has a relative who works at the company and have referenced this person in other comments. Jane and this relative are very close and seem to have an unhealthy relationship where they both resent and blindly defend each other. They live together and have worked together in the past, so I suspect there is some deep-rooted codependency. Regardless, the blind defense comes in here. Basically, Jane's relative decided to steal Sarah's phone while Sarah was away from her desk and screenshot the messages Sarah had sent to one of her friends complaining about Jane. I don't know the exact content of the messages, but from what I understand, they were pretty offensive. Jane's relative then sent the screenshots to HR as evidence of bullying. In our state, stealing and accessing someone's personal device is a crime. Regardless, HR got involved and had some sort of conversation with Sarah about the unkind nature of her texts, and everything went to hell from there. I'm still upset that HR chose to do that, considering the texts were brought to their attention through an obvious crime. As far as I know, Sarah was not written up or officially reprimanded, but the damage was done. 3. Jane escalates and destabilizes. People began to openly shun Jane and her relative, which only further upset Jane, who blamed it all on Sarah's influence. Suddenly, rumors that Sarah had physically attacked Jane in the office sprouted via Jane's relative, though no official reports were ever made. Jane's relative told people that Jane was too afraid to speak up. Jane began to openly cry and have panic attacks on the work floor, claiming she feared for her life. She only acted out this way when leadership was not around and conveniently only had her meltdowns around other regular employees. Unfortunately for her, people continued to avoid her, and employees from other departments began coming to my department's leadership with complaints about Jane's erratic behavior. 4. Physical/sexual assault reports. Back in my first post, I mentioned that Jane had slapped the backside of a woman she was fixated on. Well, in the midst of all this, that woman officially reported to HR that she had been sexually assaulted by Jane. And what do you know? Within a week, another 2 employees made their own reports of inappropriate physical contact. Apparently, Jane had a pattern of poking/tickling people and coming up to them at their desks to rest her head on their shoulders. The woman who had been slapped spoke to me after her HR meeting and said she felt badly for not reporting sooner but had feared for her safety, as Jane had made retaliatory physical threats in the past with no noticeable consequence. She was also afraid Jane would turn the situation around on her and make it seem like she had initiated the inappropriate behavior. Considering Jane's history, this was a very valid fear. 5. Jane and her relative resign. I don't know exactly what pushed Jane over the edge, but in the middle of a random Monday, she had some sort of crisis. I did not witness it, but I was told she burst into sobs on the work floor, saying things like "I can't do this anymore and I'm effing done." One of the employees claimed she cried so hard she was choking and gasping and had snot face. One of Jane's favorite things to do at work was to make little sketches and tape them around her workspace. Right after her meltdown, she returned to the office, dramatically tore all her pictures and sketches down, ripping some apart, and demanded a meeting with the manager. The 2 of them left the room, and about 10 minutes later, the manager returned alone. 6. Exposure of sabotage. Jane did not return to her desk. Apparently, she had quit. I found out later that Jane's relative had also quit that day. Neither of them gave any notice. As a parting blow, one of the 2, not sure which, posted the screenshots of Sarah's text messages on Facebook. Jane also allegedly made a post accusing the company of enabling bullies and bragged in the comments that she had purposely misplaced/destroyed important materials to sabotage a random employee, whom she named. That employee had been spoken to several times over the past few months for misplacing materials and had been scrutinized by management for assumed negligence. No one knows why Jane would go out of her way to antagonize him, as he's a very quiet person who avoids drama. I personally speculate that Jane may have felt rejected by him, as she appeared to flirt with him when she first started, until she realized he's not attracted to women. But again, just my speculation. Anyway, I'm assuming Jane and her relative realized they had massively screwed up, or were legally threatened, because both the post admitting sabotage and the screenshots from Sarah's phone were deleted from Facebook within a couple of hours. 7. Conclusion. Things are back to normal now. People are noticeably happier and more relaxed, and our productivity has skyrocketed. People, myself included, are still upset that Jane wasn't fired back when she first made physical threats in the workplace, but morale has been great regardless. I have no idea if the company is planning to sue Jane for purposely destroying/misplacing materials, but my gut says they just want the whole situation closed and will let her walk with no consequences. Our company is in the medical field, and the materials Jane destroyed/misplaced were related to clinical studies for cancer patients, which is absolutely horrendous. The young man Jane accused of sexual harassment is back at work and seems to be doing just fine. I've noticed that other employees have been going out of their way to chat with him and make him feel welcome. Some very kind people asked me to take care of myself, which I appreciate. I'm doing much better now and trying to get back on track mentally. I've been cutting back on alcohol and leaning into my hobbies and social life. I had a long talk with my wife the week Jane quit and apologized for falling apart and burdening her with my mental weight. There were a few nights during the worst week where I drank myself to oblivion, shame spiraled, and slept on the couch because I felt she didn't deserve to sleep next to a miserable drunk. My wife accepted my apology immediately. She said she had been very worried, because my distress and regression were extremely noticeable. When I admitted I'd been sleeping on the couch out of shame and thoughts that she deserved better, she teared up and began to scold/aggressively hug me for my criminal levels of idiocy. I'll be doing everything I can to build better coping mechanisms so that, should something like this happen again, I'll minimize the effect it has on her. So while we didn't go on a vacation to Greece and become pregnant with twins, we're hanging on decently. She's been a little shaken since the whole debacle, and I don't blame her. I'm doing my best to get my act together for her, she deserves the best. I have no idea what Jane and her relative are doing now. I heard yesterday that they've moved to a different state, which they had talked about in the past. There were concerns they'd attempt to cause more trouble down the line, but considering they have no legal legs to stand on, I doubt it. However, should Sarah or one of the people Jane inappropriately touched express interest in pursuing legal action, I will remove my posts to avoid harming their proceedings. Anyway, that's the update. Apologies again for the long delay. Thank you again to the many kind people who offered advice and well wishes, I appreciate it a lot. I honestly felt like I was going insane at some points, but reading other people's stories about dealing with Jane like people really brought things into perspective. If there's a moral to this situation, it's that mental health is not a joke, and if you think you have some issues, especially severe ones like Jane's, please seek treatment. Thank you all. I hope everyone has a great day. Top/relevant comments. Commenter. Normally, I'd think this was fake, but I had an ex-friend who behaved like this, has a similar build, and has a relative who works in the medical field. There are enough matching details here that I honestly wouldn't be surprised if it was her. Commenter 2. I think I just read an episode of The Office.